Hello everybody and welcome back to the Jack Threlfall Show. We are back in the studio after a long Easter break with plenty of motorsport action to get caught up on, so let's get started. We're going to be catching up on loads of different categories this episode, from Formula 1, IndyCar, MotoGP, NASCAR, Formula E and WRC. They've all had plenty of action over the last month, and we're going to get started with the Formula 1 because there have been two Grand Prix since we last recorded the episode with Oscar. We had the Australian Grand Prix couple of weekends ago, and now we've got the Imola Grand Prix as well. Both completely action-packed, with real mix-up to the championships in both, really different dynamics, and a real change-up in between the Grand Prix. I think Imola, everyone was really saying, even in our episode with Tommy, was saying that, the big influences, the big first upgrade to the season, Imola's when we're really going to see them all, and he expected a little bit of a change to the running order in the paddock. We did see the kind of Ferrari-Red Bull battle carry over from Australia to Imola. I mean, we've had that going really since Bahrain now. We're 4 Grand Prix in total, and it really seems like that battle is going to dominate at least the Constructors' Championship and, play a pretty significant role in deciding the Drivers' Championship. But at the moment, it really does seem like a Leclerc and Verstappen fight there. But I think like we also saw last year in the championship, that second driver role that Sergio Perez and Valtteri Bottas were playing for Mercedes and Red Bull last year, Carlos Sainz and Sergio Perez this year are going to have an equally important role to play, not only in delivering the Constructors' title for their respective teams and making sure that they're able to deliver the points. If their teammates finishing first, it's up to you where you finish relative to your teammate, how many points you're able to bring home. They're taking all the headlines, but what are you doing in the quiet moments when no one's watching? How can you really deliver that value for your team? Realistically, we've seen Sergio Perez probably have a better start to that in terms of consistency, but 2 out of 4 of the races have been unfortunate incidents for Carlos Sainz, and it's not really, we haven't really had that much racing yet. We can't really say like Carlos Sainz hasn't performed well or Sergio Perez is performing so much better, because realistically after only 4 races you haven't got that much to talk on, and if you're talking about generating a reliable conclusion, you need a big sample size of data for that. And with these 2022 Formula 1 cars, we've had a huge amount. I mean, obviously testing was kind of the first time we got to saw what the characteristics of these cars were like on track, and everyone was a little bit doubtful about their control through the slow speed corners. They looked a little bit sluggish. Obviously, the effect called porpoising was kind of the big buzzword for this year. I think last year in testing, we can look back to it now, the buzzwords were kind of rake was a big one, which referred to the difference between the height of the rear and the front of the car, so the angle that was created between the difference in ride height between the rear and the front of the car. That was really important in 2021 testing because they'd taken away a section of the rear downforce, a bit of the floor in front of the rear tyres, and that was kind of the big technical change for 2021. And then it was that technical shift that really pushed the discussion in 2021 testing towards rake, because the height of the rear of your car suddenly became very, very important for generating downforce on the rear of the car. And it was something that Mercedes really didn't have in their car, and something that Red Bull did have that was fundamental behind the kind of change in technical advantage in the running order of the cars for 2021. And so for testing this year, the buzzword was porpoising, and it was all to do with how the cars behaved on the straights, because you had this kind of new downforce setup. And what it was doing effectively was pushing the cars back down into the track too much. The cars would then hit the bottom, effectively bounce back up, because when the cars got too low, all the downforce and kind of all the clever bits on the car would stop working, and the car would just go too aggressively. It would kind of bounce up, skip up off the ground. The floor would then go back up into the air, and then it would get pushed down by all the downforce again, which would start working again and put it, back into the ground. So it was a really weird effect to see, because it was almost like the parts on the car were working too well. The downforce was too much. It wasn't really balanced in the right way. So it was pushing the car down too much, causing it to stop working and then start working again too much. And then once you get into that cycle of the parts on the car really aren't actually serving to benefit the speed of the car, you suddenly have a new thing that you have to fight against, a new bit of the car's behavior that you have to adapt to as a driver. And we've seen a lot of teams suffer with that problem. Mercedes has been kind of the big headline one, because obviously they were running so high last year and have done for effectively the last 10 years in Formula 1. They've been near the front of the pack, if not the leading car every single year. Suddenly we go through this big technical change, and there's this big critical problem that they haven't been able to figure out, right? But they're not the only team that's suffering from the porpoising. Ferrari have it, and they're probably the top running car at the moment overall. That's between Ferrari and Red Bull, depending on the track advantage, and obviously reliability has come to play a huge, huge role in this championship so far. But we know the title battle in the Constructors is effectively between those two teams. And one of those two teams, Ferrari, still has issues with the porpoising. They haven't got it solved on their car, but the other relative strengths of their car are so good that they can still win with the porpoising, right? And that's what we saw in Australia. We saw Charles Leclerc take a really, really dominant victory there. There was a pretty fair challenge from Max, but overall it looked like the dynamic of the pace of the car really just made that Charles was going to run away with that race. He had enough speed through the pit stops, through the in-laps, through the out-laps, those critical moments in the races. Charles had the car underneath him to kind of take the benefits where they needed to be, and he was able to defend as well. We know Max Verstappen's now notorious tactics on the safety car restarts. Charles Leclerc was able to defend against that. It did look like one time, I think on the first safety car restart, Leclerc had a little bit of an error out the final corner, but he was able to kind of bring it home, and it really didn't look under threat too many times throughout the entire race distance. So your final finishing order for the Australian Grand Prix was Charles Leclerc, Sergio Perez, George Russell, Lewis Hamilton, and Lando Norris. Those were your top five. Max Verstappen did put in that significant challenge throughout the Australian Grand Prix, but we know, of course, that his power unit or some internal part of the car caused him to DNF in that race and lose power. Whether it was the power unit directly, whether it was a part that was transferring power between the power unit and the gearbox or between the gearbox and the drive shaft, I don't think it's been officially released, or there's really a lot of speculation about what the cause of that problem was. We know Red Bull had their double DNF in the first race of the season in Bahrain, and everyone was kind of putting a lot of speculation, a lot of pressure on what the causes of these DNFs were. It turned out to be a fuel pump issue in Bahrain. That was the kind of critical error there. It was a standardized part between the teams, but whether it was because of the installation or unluckiness or whatever, it's a standardized part between the teams, but it's failed on the Red Bull car. So however that standardized part is being integrated with the rest of their, obviously customized systems on their car, the other teams were all using that same part, but it didn't fail, and it did fail on the Red Bull car. So even though it's standardized, you kind of have to look at it like, well, what's really going on there? It's obviously the role it's playing in the Red Bull system wasn't working, but they seem to have got that figured out, and we know after Australia, they came and they took a 1-2 in Imola in an incredible, incredible race there. Lots of drama all the way out through the sprint race, through qualifying as well on Friday, and through the Sunday race. But we'll touch back a little bit on Australia just for now. Besides the Charles Leclerc dominant victory there and, quite a balanced running order, impressive result for Checo to finish P2. I think especially, we spoke about earlier, it's really important to see where you finish when your teammate isn't winning, both and when your teammate is winning, of course. But as a second driver, if your number one car, your team's number one car, ergo Max Verstappen at Red Bull, he has a problem, whether it's an incident that Max loves to get himself caught up in quite often, or a mechanical DNF, it's going to be up to you then to maximize your potential result, not suffer the same issue, maybe not take the same risk, but deliver a pretty kind of high maximal opportunity result for the team. And when you're in a Red Bull car, you're going to have the chance more often than not to do that. And Checo did exactly that by finishing P2 in the Australian Grand Prix. I think it was really critical as well that we saw the changes to the Australian Grand Prix track play out really well. I think we saw some brilliant, brilliant racing throughout that. There wasn't really a dull moment. The atmosphere in Melbourne was incredible. The atmosphere of the fans throughout the entire weekend, we had the V8 Supercar Series was racing at the same time, and there were plenty of other junior formula running around that track. And it really just seemed like the organisers, the promoters, had nailed generating that hype for the Grand Prix, and the attendance was high throughout all 3 days. Everyone was loving the junior formula. I'm sure it was brilliant for those smaller series to kind of piggyback off the success of the F1 Grand Prix and return to Melbourne after that really, really kind of weird 2020 Australian Grand Prix that wasn't a Grand Prix, when everyone thought, maybe we'll go on Friday, and then they went through the sacrifice of travelling all those people to Australia, and then McLaren had a team member that got COVID, and then they pulled out of the race, and then Red Bull said, we are still going to race, but then Formula One said, no, we're not going to race, but then they said it in a press conference that was full of a room of people, and everyone was like, well, why are we here then if you're here to tell us that it's unsafe to be here? They all gathered in a room together. It all felt very, very weird. I know watching that back on the Drive to Survive series, it was one of the stranger moments where we kind of thought, this is a bit of a circus here and it's not really going to plan. But of course, nothing in the world. March 2020 went to plan. But this year, it really, really did go to plan. It was really cool to see the Australian Grand Prix back in full swing with those changes to the track playing in full effect and really being able to benefit as well, kind of working in synchronization. We've got these new cars that are better at racing side by side, and we're giving these new cars a better Australian Grand Prix track that encourages that side-by-side racing. So that was really, really cool. We also had Alex Albon take points in that race. That was a really amazing result for him. Really weird strategy by Williams to run in a way that allowed them to kind of carry through that tyre where through the 2 safety car periods, they were really, really critical in allowing Albon to make this strategy work. But it was a really big part, was Alex Albon's driving. To stay in the race, to be competitive, to not just be losing places here and there or dropping a wheel or locking up or whatever. To keep the hard tyres in pretty good condition, at least, for the entire race distance and then come in on the final lap and come out in a place where you're still able to bring home that vital point for Williams. We know the points are going to be spread around the championship a little bit more this year, and Williams, unfortunately, they might be on the tough side of that. It seems like at the moment they're really battling with Aston Martin for 9th and 10th in the Constructors' Championship, because we know Haas, as much as they were 10th last year, they're really kind of regressing to the mean, I suppose, this year, or at least they're back up, fighting for maybe like 7th and 8th instead of 9th and 10th, right? So it really seems that role that Williams are playing in the running order, at least at the moment, while it's really, really impressive that Albon was able to deliver that point, the fact that he had to work so hard for it and he had to try something so weird, ultimately that's like not a good sign, because you have to reward that performance on the basis that Alex Albon did really well in that moment. The reason everyone's so happy about it is because it was so hard to do, and then the reason it was hard to do is because Williams aren't really providing him with that good of a car. I mean, they've got the Mercedes engine, which we know has taken a toll all throughout the Mercedes customer teams, Aston Martin, and obviously the Mercedes head team as well. But McLaren seem to be making that Mercedes engine work, and we know for Mercedes, it's got to be quite unsettling when, at points, it looks like their customer team, McLaren, as much as McLaren are effectively a factory team in their budget and their team size, they're a customer team in the engine department, and they're a customer team of Mercedes. So that dynamic between the customer teams and the factory teams, I think when you turn up the pressure a little bit and you're not the best performing engine on the grid, Mercedes are going to have to deal with that pressure in a little bit of a different way. I think we saw that kind of relationship manifest in its worst way with the end of the Red Bull-Renault dynamic, where obviously you have Red Bull, who are incredibly strong as a team and deliver pretty good results every year, no matter the technical change, since they've come into the sport, really, since 2009, where they launched a significant championship challenge against Brawn and Jenson Button in the second half of that season. They just really haven't given up. Every year they've been, to some extent, in the fight, apart from maybe like 2015, 2016, but a lot of that was then because of driver changes, of course, because of Sebastian Vettel leaving, but they still had Daniel Ricciardo, who, at the start of that early hybrid era, Daniel Ricciardo was really at the top of the driver market, apart from Nico and Lewis. I mean, he was driver of the day, I suppose, most races. He was the one that was really pulling the most out of the car most frequently, right? But Red Bull did have a little bit of a downswing there. But then, a lot of that came back to the mechanical reliability of the Renault engines, which then turned the pressure up, which is why they then broke with Renault, got with Honda for a few years. Honda then decides they're focusing more on the bikes, focusing more on IndyCar, leaving Formula One. Red Bull then take over Honda. And that's where we've, kind of got to the power dynamic, power unit relationship in the paddock at the moment, where we have Red Bull taking control of the first time for their own engine production, which is why so many questions of reliability are being raised this year, because of that new dynamic and because of the new kind of customer dynamics, because we could see eventually Red Bull starting to sell to other teams. At the moment, that kind of product pitch isn't brilliant, because we've seen those DNFs come to play not only for the Red Bull top team, but also for AlphaTauri at points. We've seen a lack of reliability there. But we could see a dynamic in a few years where Red Bull are selling engines to other teams. For a team to make that switch from Mercedes power to Red Bull power would represent a bit of a change up in the relationship dynamic of the paddock, and it might be a bit controversial at the time. Realistically, with the context we're in modern Formula One, everything's a controversy, everything's drama, everything's Netflix. It's very hard to pick apart the real stuff from the fake stuff nowadays. I think F1's really suffering from that, in my opinion, relative to other series, as much as it is going to be the biggest, most spectacular, high-budget, high-stakes racing series in the world. There are a whole host of drawbacks that come with that, and I don't think F1's doing a very good job at fighting against them, but hopefully we can do a little bit of that on this show. So we can move on now from Australia to Imola. We had a very, very dramatic weekend there, with quite a different running order. I mean, obviously Leclerc and Verstappen was still the title fight there, but ultimately it was a Red Bull 1-2 that brought it home, and then we had Lando Norris rounding out that podium, right? The Red Bull 1-2, hugely significant in the championship for them to come back from a really tricky race, obviously having Their number one driver, Max Verstappen, DNF in Australia. Sergio Perez finished second. It's not a terrible result because it's showing you Sergio Perez is going to be there to pick up the pieces when he needs to. But you don't want just a 2. You want a 1-2, right? And that's what they went and got in Imola. So that was really powerful for them. Really, Max was showing his strength. No one really forgot that Max Verstappen was the world champion. He's an absolute demon in that car, and he's going to wring the neck out of it. And a race like Imola, where you're going to throw those wet conditions at him, it's Max Verstappen that's going to be one of the ones who's going to take the crown there. But look, Formula One's full of amazing drivers, and the best drivers are the best in the wet. And we saw that Leclerc as well, pretty good throughout the race. Ultimately, we know that mistake at the chicane while he was chasing down Perez to try and get back up into the points, while that crossover point between the Inters and the Slicks was going on, and was all getting a bit mixed up towards the middle of that race with the tyre strategy. Ferrari knew they had to play that risk because they were in third. They thought, what do? We're going to try and do, a little bit of the kind of one-stop v2-stop thing where you have enough time in the race to pit onto the softs, then to make back up the difference with the softs and try and catch the guy in front. We saw that play a very significant role in the Hamilton and Verstappen fights sometimes. I think in like Portugal, that was what happened in that race. That was defined by the strategy battle. Similar effect in Budapest, I think 2019, and Spain last year as well. So what's happening in that situation is when you've got a car out leading, the car in second thinks, well, if I pit, there's enough time for me to make use of these younger, fresher tyres to gain back the lap time that I lost in the pits, plus a little bit more. So ultimately, they were effectively just trying to take time off of their overall race distance by using that pit stop, right? But I think for Leclerc, it was more about the fastest lap. I don't think they had any actual ambition making back up the entire distance lost in the pit stop, but they were trying to get back up, try and take that fastest lap point, because we know we can look back on now between Hamilton and Verstappen, those little fastest lap points were really, really critical. And it was a bit more than gamesmanship. We know in the Sebastian Vettel V8 era, the fastest lap for him was something he would toy with. He would be out leading the race, and you'd have the engineers on the radio saying, Seb, it's all right. We've got tyre temperatures. We've got high engine temperatures. We need you to just slow down and manage the gap and control the temperatures. And then you'd see, bam, Sebastian Vettel fastest lap. Bam, Sebastian Vettel fastest lap. Just to play that mental game, I think, with the other drivers. And probably a little bit to entertain himself, because sometimes I think, especially like the end of 2013 and towards the second half of the 2011 season as well, when he had really significant points leads in the championship, Seb was kind of doing whatever he wanted at times. And when he had that power to lead the race, he was demonstrating that power by saying, I'm not backing off, I'm still going to take these fastest laps. Leclerc was obviously doing something very, very different in trying to maximize points from third place and think, look, I can finish third, or I can finish third, get the points for third, and then get an extra point on top of that. But ultimately, he was, trying to minimize his points lost in the championship relative to Verstappen in this race, because we have Verstappen, he took the points for the sprint race, for the fastest lap, and for the race win. Hugely, hugely influential there when he's able to look at that. That's a points total that only 3 Grand Prix this year are going to have that in total, like, net points available, because you get extra points for the sprint races, right? So only the sprint race weekends, you're going to be able to get, I think it would be 34 points in total, because you get 8 points for the sprint race win, you get 25 for the Grand Prix, and you get 1 for the fastest lap. So in my head, unless I'm going crazy, that's 33, right? So, or 34, brilliant. But, close enough. And we're looking at those numbers, and for Verstappen, it's really, really significant to go from a DNF in the last race, it goes down as a big old 0 on the championship challenge, back to a win, right? So the Verstappen season this year is DNF, win, DNF, win. So what's going to happen next time? Will he finish the race? Will he win it? Or will he kind of break that cycle and come out in the middle of the pack? It's a complete fallacy to assume that he's going to kind of take on that pattern for the rest of the season, because the events of the past have very little to do with the events of the future in Formula One. Swings happen in the championship, development, kind of upgrades can change it all around, driver mentality can change around, but we know with Verstappen, he's going to be fighting all the way, and a result like they got at Imola is going to really, really aid them in that fight. Really, really cool weekend overall, I think. We have Vettel getting points at Imola for Aston Martin, their first points of the season. Pretty significant result for them. We had Ricciardo and Sainz getting their tangle on the first lap. That was, pretty... it was a racing incident, but it did seem very unfortunate for Sainz. Imola, the first 2 turns, they don't really allow for too much side-by-side action. We saw really that incident between Ricciardo and Sainz kind of fall back through the pack in its effects because everyone else has to change their line to move out of the way of that incident. And then in the moment when everyone's kind of skipping out the way of the incident, there are moves to be made there. And that was really the first point at which we saw Sergio Perez make a really critical set of overtakes where he was able to move a little bit further forward compared to where he had started the race, right? So he was able to kind of swiftly move through that incident between Ricciardo and Sainz. Sergio Perez was the one who was able to really take advantage of that. We also had Kevin Magnussen finishing P9 in Imola. It was the second time he'd got points for the Haas team, and he's really, really adding to their championship challenge. We know that Mick Schumacher, hasn't scored points yet at all with Haas. He's had, I think, a couple of P11 finishes, but ultimately he really needs to, at some point this season, put in some proper performances because, look, as great as Kevin Magnussen is, he had a year out of the sport, right? So Kevin Magnussen wasn't driving a Formula One car last year, but he's coming back in and he's really kind of showing Mick Schumacher up, who obviously Mick Schumacher had a very uncompetitive teammate last year, but he benefited very much from the narrative that, oh, Mick Schumacher's beating Mazepin every weekend. Look how great Mick Schumacher is. His car, isn't the best, but he's able to beat his teammate every weekend, right? Everyone was taking that in Mick Schumacher's favour. And as good as Kevin Magnussen is, he's come back into the sport from a year out and he's beaten Mick Schumacher like for like in most scenarios so far. I don't think ultimately that reflects, it reflects well on Kevin Magnussen, showing that he can do that. And everyone's very impressed by how brilliant he's been able to come back into the paddock, come back into racing and show the Haas team like a positive vision for the future of their car and the future of their results and ultimately the future of their investment, right? Because I'm sure at the moment, like 2-3 months ago, the Haas investment pool must have been very, very small. And then obviously with everything that's happened with their structure and where their money's been coming from, how that's all been shaking up recently, I think there's a gap now in the Haas funding market. And suddenly the investors aren't buying into a team that's been left for bankruptcy by Ukrainian, war and a Russian oligarch. Suddenly they're allowed to buy into a team that has actual results, has a pretty decent class of driver, and is ultimately probably going to be able to accept less money for sponsorships than other teams because Haas are in a position where they need the money a lot more. Their relative marginal gains from that money are going to be pretty significant because they're running on one of the lower budgets. We have a budget gap now. Ultimately, the budget gap, it does what it says on the tin to a certain extent in limiting the spending between the teams, but it's not a perfect system, and Haas really are in need of that money. So they're going to need a kind of 2-driver challenge to really attract a lot of that money. But Kevin Magnussen's doing a pretty good job on his own at the moment, but I'd really love to see Mick Schumacher get up there. We did, of course, have the Instagram moment of the race. Everyone was very, very excited about Mick Schumacher and Sebastian Vettel on track together, racing together, and an overtake in the points positions at the time happening between Mick Schumacher and Sebastian Vettel. Everyone was very excited about that. I did think it's kind of a cool, kind of a poetic moment. We've got a whole season left of racing, and ultimately these two guys, it would be a lot cooler to see them fight higher up the points tally, right? That's really where the drama would come in. And I think also we might see a little bit more defending from Vettel in that situation. I think, as much as I like seeing them interact, and it's cool that we have a real genuine friendship, kind of mentor dynamic there. They're all buddy-buddy. But, it's Sebastian Vettel. We're going to forget that he was a proper championship winner, a 4-time championship winner, and a really aggressive racing driver when he needed to be. Obviously, he won a lot of his races starting from pole. He was really, really good at building a gap in the first stint of a race and managing it. He had a lot of boring victories, Vettel, but not all of them, and not all of them were victories either. He had a lot of races. Obviously, Brazil 2012 stands out as the big one, where he did have to come through the pack and where he really did show his quality in that way. So I would love to see kind of Seb and Mick battle for a points position higher up and go kind of more than one corner with actual moves going back and forth, and to see what Vettel would do when the stakes were high and when he didn't just want to let Mick pass to be nice. But we know, of course, in that Brazil 2012 race, one of the defining moments of that race that was so ingrained into Formula One history and really incredible in that moment, it was the moment when Michael Schumacher let Sebastian Vettel past effectively to gain up another position. It wasn't a position that Vettel needed explicitly, and he would have, I think, won the championship either way did Michael Schumacher not give him that position, or if he did. But the significance of that, where you have Michael Schumacher moving out the way for the new young German world champion to come in, at the time to win his third title. Pretty incredible stuff. And then obviously we know Vettel later moves on to Ferrari like Schumacher did, and the whole context there is cool. But ultimately, yeah, I'm basically just saying, let's get them fighting again, but let's make it for an interesting position next time. But I think with that, we can wrap up the Formula 1 talk and we can move on to MotoGP. There have been 3 MotoGP since the last episode, so let's break down all the details and all the results from those. So as I said, we've had 3 MotoGP since the last recording, and those were the Argentina MotoGP, Circuit of the Americas, and the Portuguese MotoGP. Each brilliant races, and we'll get started with the Argentina Grand Prix. That race was defined primarily by the battle between Jorge Martin and Aleix Espargaro. It was a little bit of a slow starter, I suppose. There's some great racing in the junior classes there, but ultimately it did seem like the MotoGP was off to a little bit of a kind of stall at the start. It wasn't that interesting, but the very fast corners they have there should set up a really great racing scenario. And ultimately it did. Once the tyre wear came into play, the battle between Aleix Espargaro and Jorge Martin was really critical. For much of the race it was Jorge Martin who was leading, but ultimately it was Aleix Espargaro who came to take his first ever win in MotoGP in that race after coming from second, using the tyre wear to his advantage, using the bike he has to his advantage to take the win there. So that was really cool. It was all defined really by the last 8 laps. The finishing order there, so we had Aleix Espargaro first, Jorge Martin second, Alex Rins third, Joan Mir fourth, and Pecco Bagnaia fifth. And for Bagnaia to finish fifth, ultimately, while he's not like the championship challenger everyone thought he would be, he was very much in it until the last round last season. Quartararo won the championship last year, but he was pushed a long way by Bagnaia, and it really seemed like those two were almost going to be the Leclerc and Verstappen that we have in Formula 1, right? These two young riders at different teams, both pushing the limits, both got a lot of fandom, a lot of hype behind them, and Bagnaia, he's also riding for an Italian team that has red equipment, so close enough, I thought. But ultimately, what we haven't seen is a great challenge from Bagnaia this year yet, but a P5 in Argentina was not a bad result for him ultimately. We had Brad Binder finishing P6 in that race, and what came to mind there for me, the KTMs weren't performing that highly in Argentina, but it was something that Tom Gaymore said in our interview. He was the driver coach for some junior Formula teams and had worked with Lando Norris in the start of his career. But a bit of his advice that really stood out to me was that it's where you finish when you're not winning. If you're in the right team, you're on a factory bike in MotoGP, there will be times where you have the opportunities to win races. And what we've seen with Brad Binder so far is that the bike is probably going to be there at some tracks. But there has been a bit of a mix-up in the overall running order of the bikes. MotoGP's in a really brilliant spot at the moment. Maybe not for any one individual team. I'm sure they don't like it. But we do have Honda, Suzuki, Ducati, the Ducati customer teams, KTM, and Yamaha, all within a pretty decent distance of winning. They're all going to be able to win depending on the variations between tracks, the relative differences, the qualifying temperatures, the conditions, how the riders are feeling, the risks they're taking that weekend. The causal factors that are determining race results in MotoGP at the moment aren't always just the natural pace of the bikes, because the natural pace of the bikes are so close. It's left up to the riders to make that difference. And that's the step that Formula 1 wanted to take with their technical directions. It's one that they've probably achieved more than not, but it's one that in MotoGP, they benefit massively from kind of already having created that. So yeah, pretty cool race in Argentina. Wasn't defined by too much action, but the battle there between Aleix and Jorge Martin was really cool and really emotional for Aleix as well to take his first ever victory in MotoGP. It's something that all these riders dream of since they're little kids, and taking that victory in the Premier class, I'm sure it was a nice bonus on his contract, but also personally, I can imagine it was a really beautiful moment for him and really special to take that all in. Aleix Espargaro, of course, races alongside his brother Pol Espargaro in MotoGP. Both really talented riders. Pol Espargaro is Marc Marquez's teammate on the Honda bike, so Pol Espargaro is the second Honda bike. And Aleix Espargaro rides for the factory Aprilia team, and it was actually last year at the British MotoGP at Silverstone in the summer of 2021. Aleix Espargaro took a podium there, and everyone was so buzzing. Everyone was like, oh my god, it's Aprilia's first podium in ages, I think, like at least in the last 20 years. Everyone was buzzing for this Aprilia podium, and like, oh my god, how amazing is Aleix Espargaro for getting this podium. He's really overperformed the equipment, and everyone was so thrilled for him, and he was really emotional. just to get on that podium for Aprilia. But now he's taken a win, still with that Aprilia team, and pulling them up the constructors' standings, the driver standings. Hopefully it'll go on, and hopefully we can add the final manufacturer in MotoGP into that championship fight, because ultimately for a long time it was Aprilia who were kind of the lower ranked of the manufacturers. They were at the back of the running order there. It was kind of them and KTM really that were often the lower two, where then you had Yamaha, Honda, Suzuki, Ducati as the kind of defining like higher up ones, right? But breaking that running order, it makes for really, really dramatic stuff. And speaking of breaking that running order, we have the Circuit of the Americas MotoGP, the next race after the Argentinian Grand Prix, moving up north, getting back to Texas. Well, I suppose Texas is north from Argentina, but it's the south if you're in America, but let's not get bogged down with that. Enea Bastianini took the win at the Circuit of the Americas there. Fascinating that Bastianini was able to take that win again. We know from earlier episodes of this podcast, I would recommend going back and checking it out. Enea Bastianini's first win this year, I think it was in Qatar. That win, was the first win for the Gresini team, and it was hugely, hugely emotional. At least the first win for the Gresini team in the modern MotoGP era. Hugely, hugely emotional for a team that has had a really kind of tough story, really, but a really emotional story throughout the years, an emotional ride through the circuit, the roller coaster of motor racing and Grand Prix motorcycle racing. The Gresini team has really been through it and had some tragic moments and some beautiful moments throughout the years. But it seems like Enea Bastianini's ride this year, his season, the fact that he's delivering such incredible results for that team, really, really special, right? Really, really cool that he's able to deliver those results. So Enea Bastianini's second win of the season was at the Circuit of the Americas, and it put him at the top of the driver standings in MotoGP. For a Gresini rider to be leading the standings in the Premier class was really, really cool to see. Also coming out of the MotoGP of the Americas, we had Marc Marquez, who goes down in history as the king of that track, right? I think the fact is, since they started racing at the Texas track, Marquez had won every single round there before Bastianini's win last week, or 2 weeks ago now. But before Bastianini's win this year, Marquez had won every single Grand Prix at that track the entire time they'd held it at that track, which is really, really fascinating. Even the year, last year when they'd gone there, the kind of big talking point of that race was the track surface. So they'd redone the track surface for this year's race. That was really important that they'd made those upgrades to the track surface, because it made for much kind of fairer racing, much less risk in overtaking maneuvers, much better control of the bikes all throughout, both MotoGP, Moto2 and Moto3 as well. Those two junior classes that travel with MotoGP, they all benefit from upgrades to the track, right? Because they all run on Sunday effectively in order, right? So they progress from Moto3 to Moto2 to MotoGP, and they do that at every single track, which is actually very different to Formula 3, Formula 2, and Formula 1. Sometimes when we're very lucky, we actually had it in Imola before, we see Formula 3, Formula 2, and Formula 1 all race on the same weekend, which is really, really cool. Really important, I think, also for the teams to deliver value to the people in the stands, to get them engaged in the junior class of racing and show that there's real quality there, there's storylines, there's drama, there's team dynamics, there's opportunities for incredible sporting moments in those junior classes. But ultimately, sometimes they can lead to quite boring races, and it can be hard to follow on throughout the entire season to watch every round of it. The way MotoGP takes care of that, instead of having Formula 1 where they just kind of show either Formula 2 or Formula 3 or neither sometimes, but they won't have, both Formula 2 and Formula 3 at every single round, which MotoGP does that. So every single round of MotoGP, there is Moto2 and Moto3 there on Sunday, part of the running up to the final MotoGP, right? They build it up through the kind of broadcast in that way. So if you tune in early, you don't just see build-up, you see always, every single weekend it's on, you tune in early, you see the junior classes, whereas in Formula 1, you tune in early, you just get broadcast a lot of the time because they run the Formula 3 or the Formula 2 races either on Saturday after qualifying or before qualifying, or on Sunday really early in the morning. But it can be quite hard to keep track of when those races are because you don't know or whether there even is Formula 3 this weekend, or whether it's Formula 2 or whether it's nothing. It's much easier. I hope I've made it sound more simple. Maybe I've made it sound more complicated, but it's easier in MotoGP, I think, to follow across the junior categories. And when we have junior stars like Pedro Acosta progressing up from winning the Moto3 title last year. Now he's racing for the KTM factory team in the Moto2 championship, having a lot of success there and really showing his value as part of the rider market. Very quickly going to make his way up to the Premier class of MotoGP soon enough. He's a little bit like maybe he's like an Oscar Piastri equivalent of MotoGP. He's Spanish, he's not Australian, but he's young, he's fast, and he's taken names in the junior categories, which is exactly what Oscar Piastri did. And I think Pedro Acosta hopefully won't have to follow the similar path in the sense that he gets left out after he inevitably either wins or places very highly in this year's Moto2 championship. Hopefully he doesn't have to take that year out that Piastri has had to do. But I think in terms of like being a foremost star from the future who currently isn't in the Premier class, Pedro Acosta is your equivalent there of Piastri, right? And then moving on from COTA, we had last weekend the MotoGP of Portugal in the Algarve circuit, the same circuit that Formula One has used for the Portuguese Grand Prix the last 2 years. Anyone that's seen, either the MotoGP or the Formula One race at this track will know it's an absolutely brilliant circuit. It's really, really cool. The undulation of it, the design of it, it's a bit like the Nürburgring in the sense that it's kind of, it's not like the Nürburgring because the Nürburgring was actually naturally built, it built in those undulations. It didn't move any land around. The Portuguese Grand Prix track has emulated that in the way that it is built, set into the hill, taking some of the natural undulations, but it exaggerates those undulations to make for a really exciting racetrack. So if you even look at the pit straight, you sweep down out of the final corner, then up onto the pit straight, then down into turn one, then back up again, then back up again, then back down, then back, and then over to the left. And like it just flows through so nicely. You're either going uphill or downhill pretty much every single point of the track, right? And everything feeds into the next corner. Your exit speed is so important because it's going to determine where you are on the track, your kind of territory control, these flowing, sweeping lines that you need to take, especially on a MotoGP bike. I mean, the minimum speed, in Formula One is important, but on a MotoGP bike, I think that's even exaggerated further because you don't quite have the mid-corner like downforce or traction that obviously the F1 cars have so much more than the bikes, clearly. But the bikes, that entry speed, that maintaining kind of the track position, balancing that with mid-corner speed, which is obviously going to allow you to like get the bit of track that you want to be on. You're going to get there first if you have higher mid-corner speed. So that's quite a huge kind of determining factor there. And the finishing order at the Portuguese Grand Prix, we had Fabio Quartararo come first. We had Johann Zarco come second. Aleix Espargaro backing up after his win last weekend. He took third place at the Portuguese MotoGP. Then we had Alex Rins and Miguel Oliveira rounding out fourth and fifth. Pretty exciting race there. I think overall for Fabio Quartararo's championship challenge, it was really critical for him to get back at the top of the podium again, score some significant points, and put a bit of pressure on Bastianini. Bastianini crashed out of this race, but I think he still leads the championship. But it's a really, really mixed up championship now. I think there's like 5 or 6 riders really that are within like a win's worth of points away from the top of the standings. So really mixed up at this moment, a lot more mixed up, I would say, relative to Formula One. Formula One, we've spoken about already. Even after only 4 races, I think a lot of people are looking at a 2-driver championship fight, unless something really changes with Carlos Sainz, which everyone hopes it will. I think, it definitely could. It seems like from the interviews we've done on this podcast, Carlos Sainz has got a lot of fans around the paddock, right? Ultimately, in most people's eyes, Formula One is going to be that 2-way title fight this year. But in MotoGP, it's like a 7-way title fight. No one knows who's going to win. Jack Miller, you would hope, would be playing a role, as you would hope Joan Mir would be playing a role. But we saw the collision between those two in the Portuguese Grand Prix. So it was actually down into turn 1, what we spoke about earlier, this really kind of tricky downhill braking zone. On the bikes, I mean, you can imagine, right, a lot of the work going into that corner is being done through the front brake of the bike, but it's a downhill and it's a right turn. So you're braking, you're going very, very steep downhill, which is obviously putting pressure on the front tyre. But then you have to brake and put more weight, more force through that front tyre so that your bike is, leaning perpetually forward as you brake. And you have to balance that with taking as minimum braking force as you can, but keeping it on the track, not colliding with anyone, but then also go as quickly as you can, don't get overtaken, right? And I think we ultimately saw those factors reach a bit of a boiling point with Jack Miller, who took out Joan Mir at turn one, and we saw an incident there. Joan Mir was really not happy about it, as he had very fair right to be. I mean, he was taken out through no fault of his own, but it was also lodged as a racing incident, so Jack Miller's not going to get a penalty next weekend for it. It was Miller's mistake, but it was deemed a racing incident, which is odd. And I think people taking a look at it maybe from a Formula One perspective, there would be outcry. There would be massive, massive outcry. Ultimately, the stewards in MotoGP, there's no point kind of whinging about it. They've made their decision, and the fact is that that's the decision that they've made. So ultimately, you can't really be too annoyed about it. In terms of other headlines from that race, we had Alex Rins, who I spoke about, reading out the top 5. He was P4 in that, but you wouldn't guess where he started the race, because he started the race last of the grid. He started 23rd, effectively last, back row of the grid in MotoGP. Made his way all the way up to 4th, which a little bit like Marc Marquez's comeback. So I don't know if I mentioned it in too much detail earlier, but in the Circuit of the Americas, Marc Marquez had a really, really terrible start. He was starting quite high up the grid. Everyone was looking forward to see this amazing Marquez. He's back from his injuries. He's been crashing all the time the last few years, but he was back at his home circuit where he's won every single previous Grand Prix, starting pretty high up the grid, I think 2nd row. Everyone was buzzing, right? Marc Marquez should take this win pretty easily. Marquez had a really bad start at COTA and dropped all the way back down through the grid, and then slowly, like we saw Valentino Rossi do at the end of the 2015 World Championship, this incredible ride back through the pack and back up through the grid. Marc Marquez did that, I think, up to 6th or something in COTA. Alex Rins didn't have so much of a problem at the start as he did have a problem in qualifying that put him at the back of the grid for the start of the race in Portugal. But Alex Rins emulated that performance that Marquez delivered at COTA. Alex Rins did that at Portugal, starting 23rd, finishing 4th. So really, really impressive ride from him there. But we can move on now from MotoGP to IndyCar, and we had the IndyCar Long Beach Grand Prix a couple weekends ago now. Really, really cool race there. I would say Long Beach, even maybe to people that don't follow IndyCar, but you're a sort of fringe racing fan, you might know what the Long Beach Grand Prix is. It was a pretty famous race. I know Formula One definitely has raced there, I think, in old school, maybe 70s or the 80s, when Formula One was just racing anywhere and everywhere. I know they have used this track before, but it's been a staple of the IndyCar circuit, I guess. Staple of the IndyCar circuit rotation for a very, very long time, and it's really, really historic there. And also for IMSA, they were using that track as well throughout the same weekend, and friend of the show, Jamie Price, was there working throughout both races, I think primarily for the IMSA team, but he's Jamie, so he can do what he wants, and I think he was also photographing some of the IndyCar stuff as well for their commercial side. So it was really great to see that from his eyes on his social media channels, to learn more about what that insider story of being a part of the race in that way is like. And also the racing from IndyCar was really, really cool. Pretty much throughout the entire race distance, IndyCar was able to deliver a pretty exciting package in terms of the overall racing product. The race ultimately was defined by the battle between Joseph Newgarden and Romain Grosjean in the closing laps. Grosjean had done a really, really brilliant job to skip up from 6th on the grid to P2, ultimately putting in a pretty significant challenge for that victory against Joseph Newgarden, but couldn't really bring it home. Your overall finishing order there at the Long Beach Grand Prix was Joseph Newgarden 1st, Romain Grosjean 2nd, Alex Palou 3rd, Will Power 4th, and Pato O'Ward 5th. Pato O'Ward is a McLaren Junior driver driving for the McLaren team in IndyCar this year. A lot of eyes on him and to see how he's going to perform throughout the season as well. Obviously, because of that Formula One connection there and the Zach Brown ownership connection. P5, not a bad result for him, but should be looking to get higher up if he really wants to make headlines. And speaking of headlines, we know Romain Grosjean's got a lot of eyes on him this season because of that move to Andretti. He's got top equipment now, the capacity to deliver. He's going to be racing in the 500 this year, and he's got a lot of eyes on him. Ultimately, the popularity of Formula One, the growth of Formula One in the last few years, to do with the Netflix series, kind of, and then you look at season 3 of the Netflix show, that's Romain Grosjean's story. I mean, the phoenix rising from the ashes, rising from the burning explosion in the 2020 Bahrain Grand Prix. Romain Grosjean now got a huge amount of fans from that, and he's using those fans. He's delivering them a great racing product with some P2s at the Long Beach Grand Prix, exciting everyone there. One thing I wanted to touch on that was really important for Romain Grosjean's weekend actually was in qualifying. It's basically the same as Formula One in the sense that they kind of do it in segmented groups, and then you qualify top half of your group to progress up to the next group, and then they do a top 12 is like their Q2, And then their Q3 equivalent is called the Firestone Fast 6. And Firestone is the tyre manufacturer, effectively. So it's like having the Pirelli P1 award, right? They call it the Firestone Fast 6. That's their branding term. But effectively, it's more like Q4, really. Like if Formula One had a top 5 or a top 6 extra bonus qualifying at the end, that's basically what IndyCar does, is what they call this Firestone Fast 6. Top 6 go out qualifying again. And in that top 6, it was Romain Grosjean who had an incident there. He had a crash in that last final qualifying session. He caused a red flag. And the reason I wanted to bring this all up was because the fact that he caused a red flag meant that he lost his lap. He was probably in the fight for pole, which then ultimately, if you look at his overall race pace, if he's in the fight for the front row of the grid, he might have won that race. You know, he was able to come from P6. And the reason that he started P6 was because he caused an incident in that final qualifying session. And even though he'd already put in a lap before that was good enough to fight for pole, the rule they have in IndyCar is if you cause a red flag, you cause a stoppage to qualifying, you cause an incident that messes up other people's laps, you lose your lap. We've seen in Formula One that there is no equivalent of that rule. What we've seen in Formula One is a move defined, I think, 2015 Monaco, defined as the Nico Rosberg, where you go out, you set a lap time fast enough for pole, you're on provisional pole, people are challenging behind you, they're going faster, but you've got the track position in front of them, so all you do, go off the road a bit, cause a yellow flag, person behind you has to slow down and stop their lap. Seems unfair. The capacity for someone to do it on purpose is taken away then by that IndyCar rule that means you lose your lap time for causing that incident, right? So a little bit harsh on Grosjean. We can speculate as to whether maybe he would have won the race if he had that even improved starting position, but the fact that he was able to come from P6 to P2, still be in the fight, was really, really cool. So ultimately, yeah, a pretty cool race for Romain Grosjean, and maybe Formula One could look at adapting a rule like that. We know Charles Leclerc's 2021 Monaco, we know he didn't end up starting that race, but the way he got on pole position for that race was by putting his car on provisional pole and then crashing afterwards. And we know that it was the fault of the impact of the crash was the reason that his car failed on the way to the grid on Sunday, and he didn't start the race, so there was a very much a kind of natural justice there. And there was, this rule wouldn't really have changed anything in that situation because his car would have still been broken. But if Leclerc's car was all working in that situation, then this rule would have still taken away his lap. But then also the kind of protection element of that is because it's only the top 6 cars in IndyCar, what we saw Romain Grosjean suffer with, even if you cause that red flag, you only go down to 6th, whereas if they had it in Formula 1 in Q3, you could go all the way from provisional pole down to 10th, which would be a much more significant loss. But also, what's the problem with raising the stakes and throwing a bit of randomness and some proper punishment in there, right? The F1 teams would probably moan a little bit about losing value or whatever, try and find some economic argument for why it's unfair because it's Formula 1. But I think that's maybe a rule F1 could think about adapting. So I don't know if anyone F1 corporate is listening to this podcast and listening to me for rules advice, but it's just my personal opinion on that. And also, we couldn't touch on IndyCar without mentioning the wonderful race commentary we were treated to by friend of the show, Tom Gaymore, recent guest that came on a couple episodes ago and gave us some really brilliant insight about what it's like to commentate an IndyCar race. So, I don't know, personally for me, it's kind of really cool to have these people on the show and then to watch later, to watch them commentate a race. They've told us, they've come on the show, been really, really lovely and open to me to come on the show and talk all about their life, their craft, how they found their path in the motorsport industry. And then after I do these interviews, I get to go back to watching the racing that I was already racing, the racing that I love, and the racing that inspired me to start this show. And I get to look back on it now and I watch it with a perspective that I've now interviewed and sort of got to know some of the commentators. So it was really cool for me to see it in that sense and to see like how the stuff that Tom was telling me about race commentary, how it all actually pans out on a broadcast and what it's like having to manage that. Ultimately with Sky, it's a very different job that Tom has at the moment because it's really just filling in the breaks between the American broadcast, which is, it's America, so that they have plenty of ad breaks. It's very obvious to notice if you watch the Sky IndyCar broadcasts. The level of ad breaks and cuts and stuff that they have on American telly it's just astonishing, really. So it gives a lot of time for Tom to throw his analysis in, and it was really, really cool personally for me to see that. And speaking of friends of the show, One category we haven't got to yet is Formula E, and Jack Nicholls, of course, the lead commentator for that category, came on the show a couple months back now, and we talked all about our predictions for the upcoming Formula E season and where it looks like it's going to go. And for the 4th and 5th round of the ABB FIA Formula E World Championship, the series headed to Rome, Italy, for 2 really, really exciting races across overall one weekend. They were staging a race on Saturday and a race on Sunday. Both races had separate qualifying sessions in the morning there. So it's a really interesting format where they're trying to pack as much action as they can into a single weekend format. And I think Formula E really succeeded there. I mean, they showed they were able to deliver a really exciting racing product. And it was Mitch Evans, the Jaguar driver, who swept the weekend, taking a win in both round 4 and round 5 of the World Championship. Really, really critical there. His first wins of the season, maximised points from that weekend, from 2 E-Prix to win both in a row. Real statement on his championship intentions this year, and the car that he had underneath him as well to win it. On Saturday, really critically, he won that race. He started 9th, and it was a very classic Formula E race on Saturday. It was one that was really engaging, really brilliant to watch, and it was something that I think was probably really rewarding from Formula E, because ultimately it was the changes to their format, the decisions that they've made, the differentiating factors of that series that led to them having a really, really exciting race. So things like the new qualifying format, the 1v1 weird kind of dual qualifying format that Jack Nicholls complained about the name of when he came on the show, and really kind of broke down the point, the reason that they'd gone with that format was to make the qualifying sessions more engaging and to set up a bit more of a mixed grid. Round 5, your top 5 was Mitch Evans, Jean-Eric Vergne, Robin Freins, Andre Lotterer, and Stoffel Van Dorn. So somehow there were changes in the running order of the cars a little bit between the Saturday race and the Sunday race. I think overall, probably just because of the temperature change and the different qualifying positions are going to then change strategy. But I think that the key thing there that we really saw play a role in both races was, as I spoke about earlier, something that Formula E has made, the decision they've made to differentiate themselves from other series. One way they've done that is this kind of attack mode format where you have to go offline, and then it's basically, I would call it a Mario Kart system, where imagine if, the Mario Kart little boost pads, it wasn't just a boost for 15 seconds after you drive over it. In a real racing series, when you have a longer race distance, what effectively happens there, you drive over this little boost pad, this little section of the track, and you get 2 minutes of, I think it's like an extra 20%-ish of electric power. It unlocks that effectively in your battery, and you're able to get access to that extra boost power for a limited amount of time. But then ultimately, the reason it's strategic is because every single other car on the grid has access to it. So then you have to time, how do I maximize this opportunity? Because when you've got a faster car, you don't want to be stuck behind other cars. You want to, be able to utilize the full pace of that extra power. So if you take it, but then you are instantly stuck behind a slower car, you're using up the time that you have your attack mode. You have that 2-minute window, but you're not actually utilizing it to show that difference on the timesheets, right? So that's where the strategy comes into play. And that was the thing that really differentiated Mitch Evans in the timing of that attack mode. Other people, when they'd got it wrong, he was the one who got it right, and he was in the right place to maximize the speed of his car. And also you have, the element of tire saving is quite important in Formula E. They only use one tire compound for the entire race, so it comes more into play there when you can manage that to your advantage. And you also have, it's called energy management in Formula E. So unlike Formula 1 or a lot of, Le Mans, other racing series where you have fuel strategy playing this massive, massive role, obviously it's not quite as much as important in Formula 1 as it used to be when you had mid-race refueling. So from 2010, real shift there also with the Pirelli tyres and the loss of mid-race refueling determined in a way what the future of Formula 1 was like. But in Formula E, of course, there's going to be no capacity for refueling. Formula E, when it first started, they had to change cars halfway through the races. That was their equivalent of a pit stop, and it was actually a little bit Le Mans in that style, because you have drivers running to their cars to take them off, right? But at the moment, Formula E, the solution they found for incorporating some sort of aspect of fuel equivalent strategy alongside attack mode and alongside tyre strategy is, effectively there is a limit to the amount of energy that a team can deploy over a race distance. So it's On some level, it's to do with the battery capacity, but obviously the battery does have like a little bit more power than where the limit is, because the cars do still need to get back to the pits even if they run out of battery. There's like an extra bit of spare capacity left over. But effectively, every team has a maximum amount of power they're able to use throughout an entire race distance. And a big factor in that energy storage is the regeneration under braking that you get, designed by their very clever, very efficient systems that use the forces of the car when it goes through braking to generate power to feed back into the battery, which then can be delivered later on in the race. But the thing is, because it's a racing series, because it's all about using the maximum advantage you can get out of any single scenario, what happens is drivers will push their energy to 0.01% when it's going over the line. You don't want to have anything left in the car. Ultimately, energy is different from fuel because it's not something that's playing like a weight factor. So a thing that was really critical in Formula One, and obviously in other racing series as well, when you have refueling, the less fuel you have in the car, the less corresponding fuel weight you have in the car, therefore the faster the car will go. Whereas in an electric racing series, obviously, the more electricity you have in the battery isn't having any like performance impact on the weight of the car, right? So naturally, the only thing you really do with your energy management in a Formula E race is try and manage it as best you can throughout the safety cars, because like fuel and tyres in Formula One, safety car is going to throw a bit of a spanner in the works of the calculations in terms of like how much you should use. Basically, safety car makes it easier in effect because you don't use as much behind the safety car, so you have more to use later on in the race. So you can get saved ideally by like a late race safety car. If one comes up and you're on a low energy strategy, suddenly a late safety car comes out, and then the other cars don't get to use the advantage that they had waited to use until the end of the race. Now suddenly the safety car neutralizes that. You're able to take advantage there. So there's all these different like possible scenarios where that can play a role. But really, the reason I kind of bring all that up is a credit to Formula E. Is look, we know they're doing something different with the cities they're going to, the design of their track, super thin, really middle of city centres, sweeping, fast, well, hopefully fast. When the racing's going well, they're fast. Thin street tracks that are really designed to push the cars, push the drivers to their limits, and deliver some great, valuable, entertaining racing. Entertainment is really what it's all about, and it's what Formula E was able to deliver there. Okay, so that's 4 out of 5 categories covered for this week's episode, and before we get to the end, I wanted to touch on the WRC Croatia rally that took place last weekend. It was a thrilling return to form for the WRC as they delivered a rally that really engaged the entire audience all throughout Friday, Saturday and Sunday in a titanic battle between the youngster Kalle Rovenpera and the 2019 world champion Ott Tänak. The Estonian Ott Tänak was really putting in the challenge on Sunday. It was defined by the weather and predominantly the tyre strategy and the way it played a role in the weather, right? Rovenpera already won a rally this year, Rovenpera. Young Finnish rally driver, young star for the future. Much like we have young stars in Formula One and MotoGP, Rovenpera is really, everyone's looking to him as the future of the great next Scandinavian rally driver, right? So a lot of eyes on Rovenpera. He's leading throughout Friday and Saturday. Looks like he's going to take a really brilliant victory here again in Croatia. But what happens on Sunday is the rain comes in, and Ott Tänak had fitted the rain tyres to his car at the perfect time where the rest of the field was forced to take this compromise, and they were on dry tyres on a wet track. Tänak was able to get the wet tyres on and to drive the wet track with the wet tyres, right? So that was a huge benefit to Tänak. He moved hugely up the leaderboard on Sunday, putting the pressure on Rovenpera. Rovenpera then, they're all coming up to this final round. Tänak's got a lead, I think, of 1.4 seconds. The rally's incredibly close, but Tänak's come from a long way back to put this challenger on Rovenpera in the final day. Everyone's basically looking up to the sky for the final stage because they know they've got these two cars. One of them's on dry tyres, one of them's on wet tyres. So Rovenpera on dry tyres, Tänak on wet tyres. Everyone's effectively looking to the sky. It's like, well, it's not really up to us anymore. Who's going to win this rally? It's obviously up to the drivers and their co-drivers and their engineers as to how well they can put the cars together and to how quickly they can go. But it's up to the clouds to determine whether or not we get rain, which is then going to determine whose tyres are going to be the right temperature, who's going to have the right, standing water movement on the rally, and who's going to be able to take on the tarmac with the right equipment, effectively determined by the tyres. And what happened was the weather came to Rovenpera. Rovenpera's dry, hard tyres were able to go much, much faster throughout the final stage because of the drying track, the drying temperatures, than Tanak's wet tyres. And ultimately, the really impressive thing was that, the fact that even though many people were able to see kind of from the first few minutes of the stage when they were both running, it did look like Rovenpera's dry tyres were going to be the ones that had that advantage. Rovenpera was coming from second, and he was coming from second in the rally standings. Current leader of the World Championship, coming from second on a track. Basically, it was that crossover moment. It was the point that we see, we saw it in Imola. The point we see in Formula One races all the time where it's raining for a bit, and then it stops raining, and there's a point where the slick tyres, the new soft tyres become faster than the old intermediate tyres, right? That's basically what happened in the final rally stage. And what happened then there was that, Rovenpera was on the dry tyres at the right time. The stage had just gone just over that crossover point. But we know, especially when we see someone do that in Formula One, the first person who's out on the dry tyres is like, whoa, hold on a minute. You're taking a really big risk here because it's a really treacherous track where if you can get, really, it's all about getting the heat into the brakes and the heat into the tyres when you're driving slicks on a wet track, because that track surface isn't going to provide as much friction through those soft tyres as they would normally, and therefore you're going to struggle to get that temperature, therefore you're going to struggle to go quickly, therefore you're going to struggle to get the temperature, therefore you're going to struggle to go quickly, right? So you can see how, in Rovenpera's mind, he's leading the World Championship at this moment. He's had this victory kind of eroded away by Tanak on these wet tyres, and then suddenly you might feel a little bit like, oh my God, I can win this. The track's coming to me. My dry tyres are finally working. But you have to keep the speed up, because if you slow down, your tyres will probably stop working. So Rovenpera's options here is, it's Max Verstappen. It's win or DNF, right? Because if he just goes slowly, his tyres might fall off even further, which would put him in a very precarious position. Cold, dry tyres on a drying track is not actually what you want, because you're still liable then to that kind of, that slippiness, that loss of traction. And we know on a rally stage, you're only ever centimetres, you're very lucky if you're meters away from crashing and away from something that can destroy your entire weekend. Rovenpera's got to face up all of those risks on his warm, hopefully warm, dry tyres. Rovenpera's got to stand up to those risks, take out his dry tyres and put a challenge in and beat Tanak's time. And Tanak ultimately, on those wet tyres, was not able, his tyres were overheating. Whereas Rovenpera is focused on not underheating his tyres, Tanak chiefly is therefore focused on not overheating his tyres, right? Because they're both on those opposite compounds. So that's the dynamic going into the final rally. Rovenpera comes through and wins it. It was really, really fascinating to see how that played out. The pressure he was under in the championship and the fact that he was able to rise up to that pressure. So yeah, Kalle Rovenpera putting in the challenge. So as I said, your finishing order for that was Rovenpera, from Tanak, from Thierry Neuville, from Craig Breen, and then from Elfyn Evans, right? Those were your top five. So Breen and Evans there, the two guys representing Craig Breen, Irishman, wouldn't be very happy for me to say that he's representing the British Isles, but Elfyn Evans, the Welshman, probably wouldn't mind it. Elfyn Evans was the championship contender in 2020 who so brutally lost out in the final Monte Carlo rally of the 2020 World Championship. He's looking to provide a great championship challenge this year, throw his name into the fight in a similar way, but it looks like Rovenpera might bloody well run away with it. And if he does do that, then it could be quite a boring season. But if he keeps winning them in this particular style like he did in Croatia, then it could be a pretty legendary one. And that's the one that we're all hoping for. So yeah, motorsport's completely back underway. We know that May is a huge month for motorsport around the world, so I really hope everyone gets a chance to check out some motorsport this month. We've got Monaco Grand Prix coming up this month. We've got the Indy 500 coming up. Huge amount of action, and also we've got some brilliant interviews coming up on the show. I can tell you one that is confirmed is the Extreme E and World Rallycross commentator Andrew Coley. He's going to be our next kind of big headlining guest. Got a few other ones in the works that I probably can't tell you about until I get proper confirmation, but we had the first sort of we've had 8 interviews now on the show. Really, really brilliant ones. I think hopefully we'll have some return guests. I really want to hear more from Jamie Price, the photographer. He's heading out to the Miami F1 Grand Prix, which is obviously the next F1 Grand Prix. First race they've ever had in Miami, and I'm really excited to see how that all turns out, or at least the first race they've had at Miami at this Miami Dolphins Stadium track. Really, really interested to hear what it's like from that weekend. And obviously Monaco is going to be a big one. Indy 500 is going to be a massive one. So yeah, the month of May providing us with a huge amount of motorsport action. Thank you very much for joining me on this week's episode of the Jack Threlfall Show. It's been a real pleasure to be back in the studio, getting back into it, getting over all the best results, and I think it's been really good to kind of catch up in a wider sense, cover as many categories as I can this episode. I apologise if it's been a little fast, a little bit hard to follow, but I'll have all the timestamps in the description if you want to go back and make sure you heard the right bits and you got all the detail you wanted. But I've tried my real best to cover as many different categories as I can while keeping it fast, keeping it interesting, and bringing out the main storylines, the main headlines. But gone over an hour now, and I think it's probably time for me to wrap this episode up and say thank you very much for listening. This has been episode 20 of the Jack Threlfall Show, and I'll be back next week to wrap up all the best action from racing all around the world.